Away.
Fight with everybody every game. You fight with Drew.
I can't be teaming with him.
You fight with everybody.
I can't be teaming with him. That's all.
Jamie Newman was operating on a completely different level as a father. What he built around his children's basketball careers was unlike anything most people had ever witnessed from a parent. Depending on who you ask, it was either the most dedicated act of fatherhood in youth sports history or one of the most aggressive experiments ever run on two kids who never got a say in the matter. Millions of people tuned in, and the more they watched, the bigger the question underneath it all became. By the time reality finally caught up with the story Jamie Newman had been telling the world for years, that question was impossible to ignore. Stick around, because what this family built, how they built it, and what it actually produced goes far deeper than highlight reels and internet fame. Before Julian Newman became a viral sensation and before Jaden Newman was appearing on national television as a third grader, Jamie Newman had a much more ordinary basketball story of his own. He grew up playing point guard at Colonial High School in Orlando, Florida. He understood the game from the inside. This wasn't a man watching from the bleachers who suddenly decided to engineer a star out of his kids. He had been a player himself. He knew exactly what the grind felt like. Later, he became a history teacher and basketball coach, eventually landing at Downey Christian School in Orlando, where, as ESPN and Fox Sports would later report, he taught history by day and coached his own children's basketball teams on the side. That's not a small detail. Jamie Newman didn't just talk about developing basketball players, he built his entire professional life around it. Vivian Gonzalez, Julian and Jaden's mother, brought her own basketball credential into the family. She had played point guard at University High School in Orlando before serving 4 years in the United States Navy and later working for the U.S. Postal Service. Even the relationship between Jamie and Vivian was rooted in basketball, two Orlando point guards who understood the game from the inside, who had both competed, developed, and gone on to lives where the sport never really left. That shared foundation matters, because it shows the Newman children weren't raised on ambition invented out of nowhere. Basketball was simply the family's common language. Two parents who had both played the position, both lived inside that culture, and both understood how the game actually worked, decided to raise their kids inside that same world. The ambition wasn't manufactured, it was inherited. What set Jamie's approach apart wasn't just that he understood basketball, it was that he seemed to believe athletic ability could be deliberately engineered through repetition, competition, exposure, and a level of intensity most parents would never dream of applying to a small child. According to contemporaneous reporting from Fox Sports, Julian's daily training routine included roughly 100 free throws, 200 floaters, and 200 jump shots. That's not a regimen most adults would associate with early childhood. It's an industrial-grade basketball program applied to a kid whose classmates were still learning to read. When Julian was around 3 years old, he started showing an unusual interest in the game, and Jamie fed that interest with a level of specificity that went far beyond letting a toddler bounce a ball around. He trained Julian with regulation-sized basketballs instead of scaled-down equipment made for young kids, and he put him into competitive environments against older players from a remarkably early age.
The visual result was striking. A tiny child handling a full-size basketball while competing against opponents years older than him was always going to draw eyes. Whether that attention was the goal or simply a byproduct of the training philosophy is one of the central questions this story keeps circling back to. The moment that truly launched the Newman name nationally came when Julian was promoted to Downey Christian's varsity team while still in the 5th grade. After starting in public school, Julian transferred to Downey Christian in the fall of 2012, right around the time Jamie began coaching and teaching there. He first played for the middle school team, where he once scored 91 points in a single game, before being bumped up to varsity. The visual alone was almost impossibly compelling, an elementary schooler with the handles and scoring instincts to hang with teenagers. His highlight videos spread fast, racking up millions of views almost overnight. Julian Newman became one of the most recognizable young basketball players in the country before he was even old enough for middle school. And here's the first big question worth sitting with through this whole story. Was Jamie giving his son a genuinely rare opportunity by placing him in environments built to accelerate his growth, or was he engineering content? A fifth-grade point guard holding his own on a varsity court is inherently gripping. It's built to go viral. The real question is whether that setting was chosen because it was developmentally sound or because it was visually spectacular. Maybe the honest answer is that it was both, and Jamie understood from the start that those two goals didn't have to conflict. Julian Newman's path looked remarkably similar. Jamie appeared to apply the same basic philosophy to his daughter that he'd used with his son. Jaden was starting at point guard for Downey Christian's varsity team by 3rd grade, with Jamie coaching from the sideline. ESPN covered her breakout, and the attention that followed was massive. Television appearances, national media interest, the whole wave. Her talent was real, and that needs to be said clearly, because criticizing Jamie's methods should never be mistaken for denying his kid's ability. Jaden could handle the ball. She could score. Her skills were measurably beyond what anyone would reasonably expect from a child her age. The issue was never whether the talent was genuine. Critics' concerns were about how that talent was packaged, marketed, and funneled into a system that may have prioritized things other than the kid's long-term development. Jamie's dual role as both father and coach gave him an unusual level of control over the family's basketball narrative. He decided when his kids played. He shaped their roles on offense. He controlled the competitive environment they were placed in. He held authority as parent and coach simultaneously. That combination isn't automatically a problem. Sports history has plenty of parent-coach relationships that produced real excellence, but it does create specific risks when one person is responsible for both an athlete's development and an athlete's brand. Separating what's good for the player from what's good for the content only gets harder from there.
Social media reshaped the economics of youth sports in ways earlier generations never dealt with. A talented young athlete no longer had to wait years for a college scout to spot them in some gym at a tournament. One viral clip could rack up millions of views overnight and bring national attention within a week. Jamie seemed to grasp this before most traditional basketball families caught on. He recognized the internet as a new kind of recruiting tool, a new kind of exposure, and a new kind of business, and he leaned into it, helping produce the highlight reels that showcased Julian's and Jaden's handles, their range, their scoring, their flash. It worked. The audience grew, the brand expanded. By the time Hello Newman's premiered on Overtime in April 2019, the family had moved past highlight videos into full-fledged entertainment programming, one of the platform's most successful long-form series to date. The show followed Julian and Jaden through their high school basketball careers and family life, with Jamie as one of its most visible personalities. His confidence in his kids, his relentless belief in their futures, and his outsized personality made him one of the most recognizable stage parent figures youth basketball had ever produced. The term stage parent deserves a closer look because it tends to get thrown around as an insult when the reality behind it is far more layered. A stage parent supplies structure, access, and relentless belief in their child. But a stage parent can also pile enormous pressure onto a child to perform in front of an audience, can blur the line between who that child is and what they produce on stage, and can end up valuing the production more than the person inside it. Jamie Newman showed traces of every one of those tendencies. He opened doors for Julian and Jaden that almost no young athlete ever gets access to. At the same time, he placed them inside a structure where every performance was permanently on display. The bar he set was extraordinarily high, and as time went on, the gap between what had been promised and what actually played out became harder to ignore. That bar itself is worth digging into. Jamie didn't just tell his kids they had talent, he told the entire world they were headed for the NBA and the WNBA. Jaden was reportedly recruited by a Division I program at just 9 years old, and Jamie spoke openly and publicly about his daughter reaching the very top of both the men's and women's game. The vision for Julian was just as bold. This wasn't framed as a kid who might land a college scholarship if the pieces fell into place. This was framed as a kid on a direct path to the NBA. That distinction matters enormously on a psychological level.
Telling a child they're talented tends to fuel growth. Telling a child they're destined for one specific outcome can turn that outcome into part of their identity rather than simply a goal to chase. And when that outcome never materializes, the identity built around it can start to fracture. Professional basketball asks for things that a viral highlight reel simply can't show. Size matters at the highest level. Strength matters. Defensive discipline matters. So does the ability to function inside a team system, make sound decisions away from the ball, guard elite athletes possession after possession, and produce that same level of performance consistently against the toughest competition available. Those are the traits that separate a promising prospect from an actual professional. Julian Newman was listed at roughly 5'5" later in his career. Height by itself has never decided whether a player succeeds. The sport has produced plenty of standout smaller guards throughout its history. But at the elite men's professional level, an undersized guard has to make up the difference with exceptional athleticism, efficiency, sharp decision-making, and real defensive ability. And those qualities only mean something when they've been tested against top-tier competition. That's where some of the sharpest criticism of Jamie's approach comes in. Downey Christian was a small private school whose schedule varied widely in the level of competition it faced. Julian could put up 30 or 40 points against considerably weaker opponents, and those numbers would spread online as proof of his ability, but stats like that need context. Who was actually guarding him? How strong was the opposing team? How efficient was he across the board? What did his defense look like, and what happened once he lined up against elite-level athletes? Over time, critics pointed to a widening gap between Julian's highlight reel production and how he performed against the toughest prep competition in the country. Racking up big scoring numbers against overmatched opponents can be entirely accurate and still tell a deeply skewed story. Here's why that distinction matters. The gaudy stat lines that make the rounds online, pulled from small private school games against teams that simply couldn't compete, reveal almost nothing about a player's readiness for a higher level. No professional scout is going to care that a kid dropped 40 on a school struggling to field 7 bodies. What matters to them is how that same player holds up against athletes who came through programs with real coaching, real resources, and real development pipelines. Julian's highlight reels weren't fabricated. The footage was real, and the buckets genuinely went in, but the level of competition behind those numbers rarely got examined with anywhere near the scrutiny that went into promoting the highlights themselves. The founding of Prodigy Prep stands as Jamie's biggest structural move. As Julian moved through high school, Jamie launched Prodigy Prep, a basketball-centered school in Orlando, where he coached and his son played. That arrangement handed the family near total authority over the environment Julian competed in. Jamie had free rein to build a system around Julian's strengths, expand his role on offense, keep producing content, and fold the family's brand directly into the school's own identity. Detractors argued this decision actually pulled Julian away from the kind of rigorous, high-level competition that would have offered the truest measure of where his game actually stood. Along with it came apparel, a growing online presence, and a brand that blended basketball, clothing, media, and the Newman name into a single package. A story that had started as basketball development had morphed into something closer to a full media enterprise. And that shift carries a real psychological cost. Once a child's on-court performance is tied directly to household income and brand value, walking away or slowing down becomes far harder to do. A bad season is no longer just a bad season. It can bleed into ad views, merchandise revenue, opportunities, and the family's public standing. At that point, the child's growth and the family's livelihood become inseparable, meaning every choice about who he plays and how often carries financial weight alongside athletic ones. Eventually, the reality of college recruiting told a story no amount of highlight reels or television time could talk over. Despite the massive attention he drew as a kid, Julian never landed the high major Division I opportunity that the early hype machine had promised was coming. That elite path simply never opened up. After finishing at Prodigy Prep in 2020, Julian spent roughly the next 4 years away from organized competitive basketball, focusing instead on personal training and building out his content and social media presence. Then, in 2024, he signed on with Bethesda University, a small NAIA school in Anaheim, California. He made his college debut on October 24, 2024, going scoreless, missing all 6 of his three-point attempts in a lopsided 109-23 defeat. A few games later, he put up 6 points in a 107-54 loss to Southern Utah.
Reports afterward indicated he'd been cut from the roster over performance concerns. The same kid once billed to the world as a future NBA lock was now grinding through NAIA basketball at 23, 4 years removed from high school, in games with final scores that looked lifted from a football box score. It would be genuinely unfair to let that single moment define Julian Newman. One scoreless debut doesn't sum up a person, but it's a moment that lays bare, almost uncomfortably so, the gap between what was promised and what actually unfolded. So where does Julian Newman stand today? He's a social media personality, a content creator, and a brand. His following, though, hasn't gone anywhere. His name still carries more recognition than most players who never made it past a small Christian college program ever will. He trains, he posts, he keeps a public presence in the basketball world, just without the professional career the public had been told to expect. Whether that says more about the strength of the brand Jamie built, or more about where the on-court development came up short, depends entirely on what you're choosing to measure. Jaden Newman's road looked different, but landed in an equally complicated place relative to where things were supposed to end up. After drawing extraordinary national attention as a child and teenager, her basketball career carried on into college. She's currently playing for the Cal State LA Golden Eagles at the Division II level in the California Collegiate Athletic Association. She's an active college basketball player, and that's a real, legitimate accomplishment worth recognizing in its own right. This is the same Jaden Newman who appeared on national television as a fourth grader and was being talked about as a future WNBA player before she'd even reached middle school. And she's now a college athlete competing for a real program against real competition. That's not a failure, but it's also a considerable distance from the WNBA future that was publicly projected when she was barely old enough to tie her own shoes. The gap between what was promised and where she ended up isn't Jaden's failure. It's what happens when a narrative gets built too big, too early, around a child who never had any say in constructing it. So now this story has to answer its own central question. Did Jamie Newman fail his children? Honestly, no, not in any simple, one-dimensional sense. He didn't walk away from them. He didn't exploit them financially in a way that left them with nothing to show for it. He poured extraordinary time, energy, and belief into their development. He created chances most young athletes never get close to. He helped his kids build audiences, business skills, and brand value that still pay off in today's digital economy. Those are genuine accomplishments, and none of that should be waved away. But there's a competing read on all of this that's just as hard to dismiss. For years, critics have argued that the competitive settings Jamie chose weren't the toughest ones on the table, that the Prodigy Prep structure let Julian rack up huge numbers against modest opposition, and that the focus on highlights, brand, and content may have, at points, crowded out the kind of blunt, honest feedback that real elite development actually requires. They've also argued that the constant public promises of NBA and WNBA stardom built expectations so massive that the gap between those expectations and reality became a permanent part of how the public will judge both kids going forward. The psychology of being branded a prodigy carries its own specific dangers, and Julian and Jaden's story lays that out clearly. When a child isn't just told they're talented, but publicly declared destined for greatness, their sense of self can get fused to that declaration. A setback stops being a setback and starts feeling like an identity crisis. A bad game isn't just a bad game anymore. It becomes proof the critics were right all along. The public's investment in the story grows so large that the child can end up feeling permanently on trial, and the internet makes sure that trial never really ends. The same millions who watched Julian's best moments were there for his worst ones too. Every step backward played out in front of the exact audience that had already been told he was headed somewhere extraordinary. What makes this psychological layer especially messy is that Julian and Jaden never chose how much public investment went into their stories. They were children when that narrative was built around them. By the time they were old enough to form their own view of where their careers should go, the public had already bought into a very specific version of their future, and the public, unlike a good coach, doesn't easily adjust its expectations downward. The internet keeps the receipts.
There's a particular irony in the internet's role here. Jamie likely saw social media as a tool for creating opportunity, and in plenty of ways it was. The viral clips opened real doors, the TV appearances brought real exposure, Hello Newmans generated real income. But that same internet, which opened all those doors, also became the place where the audience permanently tracks whether the promised destination ever showed up. You can't build a public narrative around your child's guaranteed greatness and then expect the internet to look away when that greatness doesn't arrive. So what's the final verdict on Jamie Newman? Few basketball fathers in the influencer age matched his level of hands-on commitment. He put his kids through workout regimens that would exhaust grown professionals, took on the role of coach, cameraman, and hype man all at once, opened a school built around their talent, launched a TV series centered on their lives, and spent years selling the public on the idea that basketball's next great stars were being raised under his own roof. It was a massive vision, backed by real conviction, but carried out through methods that pushed well past what most people would consider reasonable.
And that approach did yield results, even if they weren't the results originally advertised. Julian and Jaden both developed genuine ball handling skill. Both became recognizable names far beyond their hometown. The family built a brand with actual market value, and both siblings walked away with audiences, entrepreneurial know-how, and a media presence that dwarfs what almost any former high school athlete ever achieves. Julian's online following, his clothing line, his content, his name, none of that depends on him ever suiting up in the NBA. That's a real asset, whatever else you make of the story. What never showed up, though, was the NBA, the WNBA, or the blue-chip college recruitment the early hype had all but guaranteed. And there's a question this story simply can't settle because it lives inside Jamie Newman's head and nowhere else. Did he truly believe those pro careers were still on the way, or did he realize somewhere along the line that the brand had eclipsed the basketball and decide against ever recalibrating what the public expected? If there's a fair one-line summary here, it might be this. Jamie Newman's faith in his kids ran deeper than most parents could imagine, and that same faith is what let him build something this large around them, while also pushing him to make promises about their futures that reality couldn't keep up with. His defining strength and his defining flaw look like two sides of the same coin. He never drew a line between what he hoped his kids would become and what he told the world they already were. Say what you want about his methods, Jamie Newman ranks among the most invested basketball parents this country has produced. He trained them, coached them, marketed them, built an entire show around their lives, and got millions of people believing they were watching the next generation of NBA and WNBA talent grow up in real time. But sooner or later, a question surfaced that no amount of viral content could keep buried forever. Were Julian and Jaden being built into professional athletes, or were they being built into internet personalities? The truth might just be that Jamie pulled off both. He just couldn't manufacture the basketball outcome to match. Let us know what you think in the comments. Did Jamie push his kids too hard, not hard enough in the right direction, or hand them something most people don't give enough credit for? Are Julian and Jaden better off having skipped the traditional route, or did all that early hype cost them more than it gave? Drop your take below.